Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar this morning. The topic is arc flash PPE limitations, and we have a presenter, Steve Quiett, online with us. He's from AMP Safety, and they are the rep for Oberon Company, who are the manufacturers of personal protective equipment. So without any delay, I'll just have Steve give a quick introduction and then go to the presentation, please. It's all yours, Steve. Go ahead.
Thank you. Steve Quiett, glad to be here, and just been with Oberon since 1999, on and off. Been in the electrical safety business for quite a while. I decided today, when I was talking to Banu earlier about doing a presentation, that I get a lot of questions in the industry about the limitations of PPE. And I'm assuming that most people on here know quite a bit about safety, and there's a hierarchy of control. And we teach that PPE is the least most effective means for handling the hierarchy of a hazard, but it is very important, and sometimes it's the only say your workers or the boots on the ground have for that type of scenario. So what I've done is I've put together a quick little presentation. I know everybody's time's valuable, and I just wanted to get this started with a hypothetical story. Now, for those of you who've been in the industry, you'll know the story plays itself out more than we'd like to recognize. But I'm just going to play out just kind of a hypothetical story on arc flash and an arc flash event. So I wanted to hire a high-paid actor, but I didn't have the financial means to do it. So I just went on the internet and I decided that we're going to introduce you to Dave. Now, some of you may recognize Dave as somebody else, but trust me, I didn't pay this guy any money for these pictures. Dave is in the safety industry. He's come up through the ranks of a company, and let's just call this company XYZ. And next thing you know, they have tapped Dave as being the safety manager, safety director. He's in charge of all safety. Now, one of the things that Dave realized real quickly is that his company wasn't even close to being compliant with any of the current electrical standards, safety standards. And Dave, not knowing that much about electricity, really had to do some digging because he knew his company had some exposure, actually had quite a bit of exposure. And so what Dave did is he did a lot of research. He dug into the current NFPA 70E revision. He started trying to understand a little bit about what he needed to do to have some compliance. He reached out to some friends in the industry. He got a lot of information, and he really had to take this information and digest it. And part of that, as he's going through this information, he really came to the conclusion that there was 5 critical steps that he and his company needed to address to have the compliance they needed and also to protect the workers. So as Dave developed these 5 critical steps to address, he got started. And the first one was to develop a strategy, put that strategy into a written electrical safety program. And I'm going to encourage those of you that are attending that don't have this step completed. This is the first step. And we all have a difference. We have a level of liability with keeping our workers safe, but we also have a level of liability for ourselves. And when I'm teaching electrical safety professionals information about electrical safety, it's really the slide that the guy's looking into the mirror. That's what it's all about. At the end of the day, if somebody's hurt, can you look in the mirror and say, we've done everything that we can do to protect that worker? So as Dave goes to the first step, he's got a strategy, he's got a written electrical safety program in its infancy, and then he gets on to step 2. And step 2 starts to cause a little bit of confusion because qualified person is actually, it's very debatable as to what it means. If I ask somebody in the industry, what constitutes a qualified person, man, you get answers all over the place. And I'm going to tell you that Dave came to the conclusion that it's really 2 things. A qualified person is somebody who has received safety training to identify the electrical hazards and reduce the associated risk, but also it's somebody who understands what they're working on. So by just taking a safety class, it doesn't make a person a qualified person. They have to be able to prove that they know what they're doing and they know how to do it safely. So as Dave kind of goes through this, he realizes that it's not all safety on step 3, he's got to get some of his supervisors involved to say, hey, when we hire a guy, how do we know he hasn't lied on his resume? How do we know that, how do we know that this guy really knows how to do what he says he can do? And, with NFPA 70E, that burden is on the employer because it uses the words demonstrate, And demonstrate is a big word that means the liability for that worker doing what he's supposed to do and knowing how to do what he's supposed to do really falls on the employer. So then Dave gets into step 4. Step 4 is really, any of you who have been in this place, it's not easy because it's not only are you having to get your company to release the money for this type of compliance, but you're also having to get the buy-in of the employees. So it's like you're in a sales position. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting classes I attended a few years ago in the IEEE electrical safety workshop was a salesman's class. And I thought, why in the world does an electrical safety professional need salesmanship? Well, it's interesting because as you know what you've got to do to get your company to a level of compliance that it needs to be at, there's a selling to management. There's an effort to get those funds released. And this is where Dave had to spend a lot of time. And matter of fact, Dave was really amazed at how much time it took to get the budget and then how much time it took to get this done, to have a company to come in and do the arc flash risk assessments and do the shock risk assessments. And then in the end, this was what the end result was, getting a label on the equipment. And this is where Dave realized now the employees, as they walk up to these electrical panels, are seeing the information they need to protect themselves. So as Dave moves forward, he gets to the next part, PPE selection. And this is where it gets very confusing because in Dave's mind, he's got all these incident energies and he's been told what that means. So he understands that he has to protect, but they're across the board. They're a couple of calories per centimeter squared at 18 inches, all the way up to 50 calories per centimeter squared at 18 inches. And he's like, what do I do? And when he goes online and starts researching PPE, he sees, wow, this company has an 8, a 12, a 20, a 25, a 40, a 65, all these different ratings of arc flash suits, and he gets quite confused pretty quickly. But what he has decided to do is he's going to separate out the larger incident energy, anything above 12 calorie, and that will be people wearing 40 calorie suits. He has no exposure over 40 calories at this facility. And he's got a lot of exposures under 12 calories. So now Dave goes to procurement. And what Dave has done is he gets back, he goes to his procurement and says, hey, we need to buy some 12 calorie and 40 calorie suits. And here's what they come back with them. Well, what about sizing? What about the type of materials? Is it inherent or treated? What about ventilation? What about the lift front or traditional hood? Bib overalls with coat or coveralls? What about the color? I mean, Dave is really at this point beside himself with how much information that he needs just to get this last final step accomplished. So it's interesting when Dave doesn't even know the difference between inherent or treated cotton. He has no clue. So he does a little research. He decides what he thinks he needs there. Ventilation, he's never even considered. Some companies offer it, some companies don't. He doesn't know the benefits of a lift front versus a traditional hood, or is there any benefits of a lift front versus a traditional hood? And then he's like, I don't even understand what the difference is between bib overalls with a coat or a coverall. So he tries to wade through all this. And trust me, if you've done this before, you know this can be quite a muddy river. It's very difficult to kind of wade yourself through this. Now, once that issue has been resolved, all is well. Everything's going good. Dave feels like I have done my job. I know a whole lot more about this than I thought I would ever need to know. And Dave is feeling good. Everything's going great. It's kind of like I have accomplished this. I'm there. And then there's that call. And he gets a call one day and it says one of his workers has sustained serious burns from an arc flash event. Of course, Dave's first question is he okay? Is he going to survive? I mean, how bad are these injuries? And this is really where none of us really want to be, but it's really what our career prepares us for. is how do we handle what happens if something bad happens? And so now Dave is in scramble mode, right? His first question was, how's the guy doing? Is he going to live? Is this something that, I mean, how bad is it? But then once he gets there, his next question is, how did this happen? You know, of course, all of us in the safety professional, first thing we're going to go to, was he wearing his PPE? And we know that's one of the biggest obstacles in our jobs. Are the people that we're in charge of for safety, are they actually going to wear the PPE? And trust me, that's an issue. I talk to people all the time that know they're supposed to wear PPE, and yet they don't. And you ask them why they don't, and they just say, well, we've never done it that way before, or I've done it for 30 years without PPE, I'm fine now. So his second question, after determining if the worker was okay, if he was going to survive, what was the extent of his injuries, he's now trying to figure out, was the guy wearing his PPE? And then the next question is, do we have an equipment failure, or was this human error? And then his next question is, well, where was the safety backup? Was there a safety backup there? And then last but not least, did we have a problem with the suit? So here's what happens. So this worker that was injured did have a safety backup, and the safety backup, they saw everything. They said, first of all, there was a loud explosion. There was a lot of light. It was blinding light. They could feel the heat wave. And after the event was over, the caution tape and the cones of the barricade were still up. They were still intact. So Dave is kind of figuring out, okay, so the guy was wearing an arc flash suit. The guy was working with a safety backup, and the guy did have a barricade up. So all the things right now are fitting into place. Now, this is when it gets a little strange, because the safety backup observed the primary worker that his arc flash suit was on fire around the hood. And he actually assisted the guy to get the hood off. Now, the primary worker sustained some serious burns on his face and neck. This is why he was transported by air to a burn center. So the safety backup actually contacted the medical team immediately, and he's also trying to console the primary worker. Now, so the storyline fits from what Dave would have expected as he was researching this. The arc flash event occurred. The only thing that doesn't make sense is, why did the arc flash PPE fail and catch on fire? So Dave now has to put on his investigation hat, and he has to dig deeper. Now, the investigation focus shifts due to the PPE failure. So then we have to determine, was there a problem with the label? Did the label tell the guy that was less incident energy than what it actually was? I mean, that's a real-time problem. But one of the things that occurred to Dave is that, you know, the barricade was still up, the cones were still there, the barricade didn't melt, so he has to kind of assume, well, it's possible that the label was correct, that the incident energy that was calculated was actually the incident energy that was experienced. So now the next question is, was the worker closer than the prescribed working distance? Because he knows from research that that can cause a problem, because we have the calories per centimeter squared at a certain distance from the event. That certain distance is the working distance. And we all have known, it's probably been heard by most of you, that if you lean in even half the distance, you can sometimes quadruple that incident energy exposure. So that was his concern. And according to the safety backup, the guy was working at arm's length. He was working like he's always worked. He was not close to the event when it happened. So he can check that off. Now, then what he's left with is, there was an arc flash suit failure. So Dave starts to scramble. Now his focus is, how in the world could an arc flash suit fail? And the first thing he's got to do is he's got to identify the manufacturer. Now, if any of you have ever been through this process, you know this process isn't as easy as you might think. So Dave gets in touch with purchasing, say, hey, we had an arc flash suit failure on the floor. I'd like to find out where that suit was bought from, who we bought it from. And of course, procurement does nothing but file invoices and purchase orders. And so now they're scrambling through years worth of purchase orders to figure out where that suit came from. And even if they can do that, because unfortunately purchasing has done something which most purchasing departments do, is they have actually bought multiple brands of arc flash suits. So they may find a purchase order and it may say a 40-calorie arc flash suit, but you know what? It may not be the right one. So there's all this scramble just trying to identify the manufacturer. And then several times the purchasing department has actually asked Dave, hey, contact the distributor because this is where we're buying our arc flash gear from. Of course, the distributor doesn't have much better records. So eventually they identify the manufacturer, and lo and behold, that company is no longer in business. And the suit is at least 20 years old. So now Dave is faced with the realization that there's a problem. The investigation uncovers all these issues: multiple arc flash PPE manufacturers. The 40 cal availability was probably the criteria that the procurement department was looking for. And then he realized, you know, not all 40 calorie equipment is the same. The PPE is in a broad range from a $600 suit to a $2,000 suit. And so Dave really has to start really digging into this now. And remember, this is really to understand what happened. It's not to go and sue somebody. He's just trying to understand what happened, because if it could happen to this one worker, could it not happen to all of his workers? So then he finds out that there's something called testing. And Dave finds out that it is amazing that some companies do not test their arc flash PPE, and some companies do. Some manufacturers don't even mention it. And also, as in most industries, a couple of manufacturers really seem to be truly innovative with unique technology, and some of them just seem to employ slick marketing hype. And so it's interesting to see that what's happened at this point with Dave is he's come to the realization that it's not what he originally thought. As a matter of fact, Dave talks to one of his safety guys at a distributor, and he says, how could you guys sell us PPE that's never been tested? And of course, the distributor doesn't know what he's talking about, because the distributor who's been in the safety industry for a long time, when they sell fall protection, they know that fall protection has been tested. You can't buy fall protection that hasn't been tested 9 ways to Sunday. But it was amazing for Dave to find out that in this industry, we have some performers, we have some innovative companies, and then we have a whole bunch of people that just cut and sew and make PPE. So the question is, did Dave buy arc flash PPE that's never been tested? How could that happen in a modern world? And how could a manufacturer even bring a piece of critical PPE to the market without even testing it? These are the questions that Dave now has to confront, because Dave, prior to this, had no clue that there was a problem in this industry, that there was an opportunity to buy something that's not been tested. So here we go, lesson learned. If I had to show you one slide today, this would be it. Always require testing data when buying arc flash PPE. It's just that simple. And I'll tell you, I've been in the arc flash PPE business for a long time, and working for Oberon like I have since 1999, I will tell you that a vast majority of my customers still do not request testing data. And in my mind, that's a critical failure, because you're buying PPE for a level of compliance, but you're also buying PPE to protect the workers. And I find it just almost ironic that the workers are going to give you pushback because they don't want to wear PPE. And then you make them wear PPE anyway, because that's what can save their life. And then all of a sudden the PPE still fails. I mean, that's like a double whammy. So when you're looking at buying arc flash PPE, start asking questions. And I will tell you, sometimes you have to get procurement in on this. There's a company I've been working with in Texas for years, and they came out with a big RFQ 2 years ago. And this RFQ was for a pretty good amount of 40 cal suits, and there was no parameters. In other words, their only parameter was a 40 calorie suit. And so I got on the phone with them and I said, look, you got to decide what type of 40 cal suits do you want? Do you want 40 cal suits that are heavy and made out of treated cotton? Or do you want some of the newer technology, lighter weight materials? And there's a reason why one's more important than the other. And that usually revolves around how long your worker is going to wear that arc flash PPE. If the guy is going to wear the arc flash suit for a few minutes to de-energize or energize a system and then step away outside that arc flash boundary, it probably doesn't matter what kind of arc flash suit he's wearing. But if you got a guy that's doing maintenance or doing repair or doing troubleshooting, and he may be in that for hours at a time, You know, sometimes we got to consider their comfort. Even though we know arc flash PPE is not that comfortable, we have to consider their comfort as we look at opposing technologies. So now Dave knows that he's got to get testing data for the arc flash PPE, but it goes a little deeper than that. What testing data are we looking for? Well, there's 3 standards I want you to remember. ASTM 1506 is kind of the benchmark standard in our industry, and it's the design characteristics, and it's on the label. If your arc flash PPE does not say compliant to ASTM 1506 on it, it's not worth anything, because that is just the baseline design and characteristics of the arc flash suit. It tells you that a company who built that suit actually has followed the standards that are in place for them to build that suit. Now, the next step, ASTM F1959. This is where the ATPV is designated. This is where you decide if the material you're putting out there as a manufacturer of arc flash material is rated to 40 calories or is it rated to 12 calories. This is where the calorie rating comes from. And I tell people, at a minimum, make sure you have a copy of the ASTM F1959 testing. And by that picture, there's a Stoll curve, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But I want you to understand there, ASTM F1506 and ASTM F1959 are the first 2 pieces of critical information. Now, if you're buying a hood, we've got to go to ASTM F2178. So now we're at 3 standards that I think are critical, and I believe are critical to purchasing PPE for arc flash hazard mitigation. And that is, so ASTM F2178 is the face shield and hood as designed and built. Now, in our industry, there's not a lot of companies that make arc flash face shields. As a matter of fact, I can tell you of 2. And one company, Oberon, makes their own face shields and puts them in their suits. The other company, called Paulson, is in everybody else's suits. So one of the problems that we found in this industry is I've had clients ask for an ASTM F2178, and what they get is the face shield test. I'm going to tell you it's got to be the whole hood, because if I'm buying a face shield from somebody else and I'm putting it in my hood, don't you think it's important that we test that hood as a whole? Because that's right where what's behind a hood is a person's face. And if you've seen as many suit failures as I've seen in the industry, you'll find out real quickly that it's almost always around the hood. And you know, this is one of the unfortunate sides of this electrical hazard, is that if that's where the arc flash is facing, that's where it's coming. And if your hood fails, it's going to be quick and it's going to be painful. So I look for an ASTM F2178 face shield and hood as designed and built. So make sure that you're getting the report from the company that's making the suit. So if you're buying the suit from ABC company and you're getting an ASTM F2178 test data and it says Paulson, that's not telling you the whole hood as it faces the arc flash. All right, so this is one of my favorite ones, and I'm gonna tell you, everybody knows I work for Oberon. I've worked for Oberon for a long time. I don't think there's a safer company in the arc flash PPE business, but I don't want to disparage other companies in this industry, because there are other companies. There's good companies in this industry that also test. And here's my thing: as a company buying arc flash PPE, doesn't it make sense to pick a company, whether it be Oberon, Salisbury, somebody else? Pick a company, stick to them, because if there's something that goes wrong, you have one manufacturer to go to. If you got 40 guys out in the field and those guys have different PPE from different manufacturers, think about how confusing it's going to be when you're trying to track down the investigation side after an incident. And so picking a manufacturer and sticking to them, in my mind, is one of the safest things you can do as an end user in harm's way, is to just pick a manufacturer and stick to them. You know, as technology comes around, if that company's innovative, they'll have those technologies. I was talking to a customer last week, and they were like, yeah, we got the latest and greatest. And I looked at the suit and I was like, man, that's treated cotton. That's been around since the beginning of time. And he's like, he didn't even know about the new ultra lightweight materials that are out. And then he was showing me the face shield. It was a green face shield. Now, this guy just bought this suit a few months ago. It's a green face shield. Man, we've gotten rid of green face shield years ago. You know, now the new technology is the true light, the true color gray, or, you know, I like to call it nearly clear. We don't have to have the guy pulling off his hood to take a look at wire colors, because now he can see those colors right through his face shield. So pick a manufacturer, stick to them, make sure you research them. You'll find out real quickly the companies that have slick marketing and no testing data, and then you'll also find out the companies that have the testing data. A couple years ago, there was an incident that occurred with one of my clients, and they called me and got me involved right at the beginning of an arc flash suit failure. And it was kind of interesting how this all played out. But in the end, I've got the distributor on the phone with me, and the distributor's like, hey, they're now going to look at replacing all these suits. They can't figure out where the manufacturer is or who even made them. And he said that, you know, I've asked this other company that to participate in this RFQ. And he said, when I asked them about testing data, he said, oh, you must be talking to the Oberon guy. And luckily, the guy who's the distributor has been in electrical safety for a long time. And he said, why do you say that? And he goes, well, because those guys are always talking about testing. And he goes, wait a minute. You manufacture an arc flash suit, you put it in the open market, and you're not talking about testing? And so that's really the reality of what we're faced with in this day and age. All right, so let's look what to look for above and beyond the testing data. So, you know, prior to 2018, we didn't have a lot of guidance from NFPA on how we evaluate a manufacturer of arc flash PPE. And I've always found it interesting where, you know, OSHA says that what you wear underneath arc flash PPE has to be natural fibers. It can't be something. And I always like, well, why is that even there? Because it seems to me that if I'm wearing an arc flash suit that's rated at or above what my exposure is, does it even matter what I'm wearing underneath? Well, yes, it does. Because what if you happen to be wearing one of those suits from a company that didn't really care to test? They're just putting a product in the marketplace. And oh, by the way, they sewed it all together with non-FR thread. So now we've got a probability of an arc flash suit coming apart at the seams as you're trying to get away. So luckily in 2018, and then again in 2021, NFPA 70E has really addressed this. And if you're looking for ammunition in your quest to buy the right PPE, this gives us an idea. It's called Article 130.7 C14, and it's called the Standards for PPE. Now, underneath that in subsection B, you're going to find Conformity Assessment. And there are 3 levels of Conformity Assessment that a manufacturer of arc flash PPE should adhere to. One is self-declaration. I want to talk about that for a minute, because a lot of times I get companies asking me, well, which level of conformity are you looking for? And I'm like, well, first of all, just any. You know, just what I love about self-declaration is at least somebody is recognizing that there are standards for PPE, and they're telling you how they're building that suit. So if they're buying material from ABC company and they're buying stuff from XYZ company and they're putting it all together into their own magical formula for an arc flash suit, they're going to tell you that in a self-declaration. But I like to go to step 2. This is under a registered quality management system like ISO, and then a product testing by an accredited lab. To me, this is where everybody, any manufacturer for arc flash PPE should strive to be at level 2. Now, for those of you that are curious about level 3, it's quite daunting, and I have been told that nobody in the arc flash PPE business will ever get to a level 3. And these are decisions made by people with higher pay grades than mine. But you know, I will tell you that if you ask for a certificate of conformity from an arc flash PPE manufacturer, you're only going to find a few. Most companies don't have it. Most companies don't even understand it. But to me, if I'm buying PPE for my employees and to protect them and ultimately save their life, it seems like I would want to work with a company that understands some of the newer revisions of the standard that actually addresses the issue of not having test data on your PPE. All right, now, how are you going to know about this certificate of conformity? Well, the only way you're going to know about it is if you ask. You know, require it. Even level 1 gives us important insight onto the company and how they manufacture that PPE. I would encourage any of the attendees today that come from the arc flash PPE manufacturing business, if you haven't even gone to level 1, I would encourage you to do so. Because what you're doing is you're proving that the product that you're making is getting out to the people, and it will do what you say it's going to do. And in my mind, we spend so much time and effort trying to get our employees to wear the PPE, and this stuff is not easy, especially in the hot Texas sun. You know, in a July, nobody wants to put on PPE at all. So make sure that when you're purchasing that PPE, you're asking about the certificate of conformity, you're requiring it, you know, so that makes your procurement department's job so much easier. You're saying, hey, I need somebody that's got a conformity level of 2. I need somebody that can have current data. And let's talk about the testing data. You know, I get this question a lot. What's the shelf life on arc flash PPE? And I used to say there is no shelf life, but I'm going to warn you. If you've got equipment that's 20 years old, I can tell you that the testing standard or the testing criteria that suit went through 20 years ago is different than what it would have to go through now. So, you know, we look at, we were given this information in an informational note, NFPA 70E, and it references ANSI ISEA 125. And that states the testing has to be done and updated every 5 years. And let me tell you, as a representative of Oberon, this is an expenditure. It's a lot of money to continue to test this stuff. But you know what? The only way that you're going to know that this PPE is going to work is if you continually test it, and you test it against the newer standards, against the newer test criteria. So also, let's talk about overprotect. And I mentioned the second test that I wanted you guys to require was ASTM F1959. So ASTM F1959 has its own problems, and that's a 50% probability of second-degree burns. Now, I know that's stated a little differently than what ASTM F1959 says it is, but I hate 50-50. 50-50 in my mind is not a good answer. So what I advise my customers to do is don't ever match your incident energy exposure to the suit. In other words, if you walk up on a 40-calorie exposure, don't put the guy in a 40-calorie suit. Go ahead and step up to a 65-calorie. It's not that much more expensive. It's not that heavier in weight. As a matter of fact, I have seen a huge movement to the 65-calorie suits that Oberon makes in the last few years because people have recognized this. Why put a guy in a 40-calorie suit for a 40-calorie hazard when for $100, $200 more, I can put him in a 65-calorie suit, which is actually rated to 76 calories, and I'm putting them on that same exposure, and I have lowered that probability of 50-50. So, and I tell people, overprotect from the outside. If you don't have that opportunity, overprotect on the inside. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you've assigned an electrical worker a 12-calorie coverall and you've given them a 40-calorie bib and coat suit, man, if the guy's working on a 40-calorie hazard, tell him to put that 12-calorie on the inside. You know what? Or do something better. I love daily wear. Oberon doesn't make daily wear, but I'm gonna tell you, I love daily wear. Put the guy in something that he can wear that gives him a level of protection right off the bat. If he's wearing an 8-calorie jeans and an 8-calorie shirt, and he puts on a 40-calorie suit over that, no, it's not 48 calories, but you know what? It's still 40 calories, but we have definitely moved the needle on the probability of second-degree burns. All right, do a quick recap. Always require testing data of arc flash PPE every time. I would never, ever, from this point forward, buy arc flash PPE that's not been tested. And what you're looking for is ASTM F1506 compliance, ASTM, and by the way, remember that compliance is going to show up on the label, ASTM F1959 data, and ASTM F2178 data, and then also testing within the past 5 years. And then last but not least, we want you to overprotect. Now, I always like to end these presentations with a simple slide, and I'll tell you, those of you in the safety profession know that this is an issue. This is the most dangerous phrase in the English language. We've always done it this way. And this is one of the things that scares me to death when I just talked with a distributor this morning who just had a meeting yesterday with a client, and that client said, you know, we've just never had to do this. We've never had to put arc flash PPE on. We don't have our equipment labeled. And in my mind, I was like, how could somebody put their workers in such jeopardy and just, in my mind, in a cavalier attitude? Just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean that's the way we should do it moving forward. So Banu, I'll open up to questions. I told you I'd keep this under 45 minutes, and I'm at 35 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So I have a few questions here. The first one is testing not regulated by CSA or UL?
Okay, say that one more time.
Is testing not regulated by CSA or UL standards?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure about the CSA. If he's talking about the Canadian standard, I am not sure about that, but I am pretty sure in the United States that UIL does not mandate the testing.
Okay. So it's all ASTM standards that has to comply with this.
Correct.
Right? Okay. So how can the manufacturer label the ATPV or EBT on their PPE without testing?
Well, so that's a great question, and let me just tell you how it happens. So if a manufacturer of arc flash PPE, so the ASTM F1959 document will come from the manufacturer of the rolled goods or the material. So that's what they're doing. They're basically extrapolating. All right, and everybody does it. Even Oberon does that. We'll take what the manufacturer says, and that's where we get the ATPV. Now, the problem is, and we can go into other standards that get to, you know, like if we test it as a whole suit, like ASTM 1506, where, and I don't, you know, it's in my mind, if it's a good manufacturer and you're buying it from a known source like Westex or DuPont, you know, they're not going to give you something that's not been tested. I will tell you where I think the problem comes from. I think that when we look at ATPV as our only threshold for safety, do we trust that the company has actually, did they get this material from a known source? So let's talk about stuff coming from China. And I don't want to pick on China because it seems like everybody is right now, but I can tell you, I'm highly suspicious of test data that comes from companies that are manufacturing in China. And I'll tell you why. We have seen the test documents where you can actually see where somebody has wiped out the original company and put their own company's name on it. It's just, it's incredible. So this is the answer to your question very briefly is ATPV will come from the F1959 testing, which is done by the manufacturer of the material.
Okay. So the next question here, Steve, is what is the design or rated life of arc flash PPE for most common materials?
All right, repeat that one more time.
So what is the design life of arc flash PPE for most common materials?
We don't have a design life. You know, there's arc flash suits that are still in play 25 years later. I wish that there was some type of standard that gave us any type of guidance on that, because, and this is where I think NFPA 70 went with the ANSI ISEA 125 reference, is that requires testing every 5 years. So that's the only thing that I've seen that gives us any type of idea. I mean, I used to tell people there's no shelf life on this. I no longer tell people that. I just say, look, you know, designs change. And I'll give you an example. There was a time when Oberon used to make a hood a certain way. Well, through testing over time, we realized that we needed to add some stuff to that hood. And companies that actually test, they'll run into that. You know, we talk about in our industry, we see this a lot, where a company has put together an arc flash hood with Velcro, and we know because we see the Velcro failure in a and I just call it hook and loop, not Velcro in general. That's a brand name, but we'll see a hook and loop failure, and it means that the company that built that never actually put it up against an arc flash to see what would happen. Because if they had, they would see that the hook and loop failed, and it's usually not even the hook and loop; it's the glue that they use. So, yep.
Okay. So the next one is, what are some of the pitfalls when using the table method for arc flash PPE selection? So there is this arc flash incident energy calculation method and a PPE category method selection. So can you just compare these two with pros and cons of what some of those pitfalls by selecting either one of those?
Well, so this is a big controversy in the industry, obviously. PPE categories is something that NFPA 70 has, and by the way, I applaud it, because a lot of times, if you're like an electrical contractor, you don't have a say on your client's facility if they're actually going to do their incident energy calculations or not. You're going to walk up to a panel and you're going to do the work that you've been asked to do. So what I like about the PPE categories is they give that guy that doesn't have that information at his fingertips to at least try to figure out how to protect himself. Because, you know, the scary part is if you're not using the PPE tables, there's no incident energy calculation. What do? Well, you're going to work in your street clothes. And we already know. You can just look at a couple of the Westex videos online, what happens to street clothes when it hit even with a minor arc flash event. So the PPE categories are, let me tell you where we kind of have a pitfall with PPE categories. If I have, let's just say I've got a label that says PP category 4, and we know that that's between 25 cals and 40 cal on the PPE category side. What if that's a 40 cal incident energy exposure if we've done our incident energy, but since we've just labeled it PPE category 4, now the guy's got a 4 on, well, what happens? Because we're telling him to overprotect. Well, if it was at 29 calories, there would be no need to overprotect because he's wearing a 40 calorie suit. It's within that range. And this is what I don't like about the PPE categories. Now, if it's at 40 calories and it's still within the range of the PPE category 4, we've got a guy who's now wearing a 40 calorie suit because that's what the label told him to do. And we know that the PPE categories in the United States don't go above 4. So how does he select something higher if it's at 40 calories? So that is one of the pitfalls of PPE categories. However, I've worked with a lot of companies that have done their incident energy assessments, and they've actually labeled it with a PPE category. And the problem is still when we reach the top end of that threshold, what do we have the worker doing? Is he overprotecting? And the companies that I've worked with that have realized that's kind of one of the pitfalls of the PPE category method, they've actually said, you know what, we're going to make our guys at PPE category 4 wear 8 calorie daily wear and the 40 calorie suit. And that in my mind is overprotecting them. Now, is it way overprotecting at 27 calories? Well, sure it is. But is it a good thing to overprotect? I'm a big fan of overprotection.
Cool. So the next one here, Steve, is it okay to share PPE in a COVID environment?
Okay, well, Madhu, thanks for that question. I'm hoping it's one of my friends that put that on there, because let me just tell you, for years, I have been in the woods crying out, don't share your PPE. And first of all, just from a human standpoint, can you imagine coming in on shift after a guy who's been on shift for 8 hours in a hot, sweaty environment, and he's taking that stuff off and you're getting ready to put it right on? I mean, that to me is just disgusting anyway. It's interesting though, that since COVID, and I'll tell you, this has been the first, I guess in March, man, everybody in the world was scrambling, including Oberon. How do we talk about disinfecting? Because I'm not talking about cleaning, we're talking about disinfecting, PPE. And the simple answer is don't share PPE. It makes no sense. It's funny, one of my customers called me and they were in a scramble mode to buy a whole bunch of suits. And it's funny because when I was there doing a presentation the year before, I had recommended, hey, y'all don't need to share PPE. And I kind of gave the analogy about the sweaty guy getting out of his stuff and I got to put it on. It's going to make my stomach turn. And one of the workers said, Steve told us not to do that. And I'm going to tell you, that's, in my mind, don't share PPE. It's just, and we know with COVID, there's a lot of things we don't know. And this is the thing with COVID going forward, man, we're learning things now that we didn't know 4 months ago, 5 months ago. It was a huge issue about contact surfaces. Then we heard, well, maybe there's not that much on contact surfaces. And I'm going to tell you, if my job is to protect the workers, I want the person wearing his own gear. And I know that it's expensive, but man, this is what we have to do, especially in this day and age. Just don't share PPE. And if you're going to share PPE, then pay very close attention to the industry. And I know Oberon has a whole thing on their website about disinfecting, and by the way, remember, we're still guessing. Nobody's ever taking an arc flash suit that was being worn by somebody with COVID and gone and tested it after it was supposedly disinfected. Did it actually get disinfected? Nobody's ever tested that. So we're giving you our best guess. But in my mind, the best thing to do is just don't share PPE.
All right. So the next question is, so you touched upon one thing about use a consistent one manufacturer across the board while selecting the PPE, right? So how serious it is if you have like a multiple manufacturer made products at a facility? So what some of those pros and cons of having those?
Yep. So in my mind, documentation is everything. You don't want to be scrambling after an event. And also, you don't want to be caught flat-footed and find that one of the companies that you bought PPE from never even tested. You can't get testing data on it. So, and listen, this is kind of it's a thing right now. It's a thing in this industry where people are going through their arc flash PPE and they're discarding stuff that they can't identify. I was at a facility in Missouri it's been about a year and a half now, and just helping them go through their PPE. And I will tell you that a majority of the PPE that we inspected, the labels weren't even on there. They didn't even have labels. And you're like, well, how do you know this is a 12-calorie coverall? How do you know this is a 40-calorie suit? And so in my mind, if you do just an overhaul on your arc flash PPE, if you find multiple manufacturers, that may not be a bad thing as long as you're documenting it. So this is a Salisbury suit here, there's an OEL suit there. Okay, you've got that information. Can you go to those manufacturers and get testing data? And by the way, I do know that people are doing that because I get those requests from time to time. Hey, we bought a suit from you 9 years ago. Can we get some testing data on that? Is there something that we can have that says that this is, this is a viable piece of PPE?
Okay. So this question is from me directly, Steve. So I not to put you under the spot right now. So the question is, I mean, from the risk control hierarchy chart from NFPA 70E, PPE is the last mode of protection, right? So
that's it. Last line.
Right. So with that being said, many facilities use elimination techniques or design engineering controls and such while minimizing the risk of exposure to their employees.
Yes.
Right? So given that scenario, so do you see from your experience that PPE is just being used in industry for compliance need alone, or do you see people really using them? Because we get a lot of excuses when you go and talk to the customers. Primarily,
Yes.
It's not convenient to work with this, right? So it just restricts our access to things and such. So what are your thoughts on that?
So that's a great question. And I'm going to tell you my very candid answer. It would be a great day in this world if our company didn't exist, if Oberon didn't exist, because that means that nobody have an exposure to an arc flash event. And if we can mitigate it down to that level at all, man, that's where I tell people all the time, don't let PPE be your primary focus on your written electrical safety program. Mitigate down those risks. If you got a 65-calorie hazard and you're now thinking about buying 65-calorie suits, why can't you mitigate it down? Why can't you bring it down below 40? Bring it down below 25. Bring it down to 0. Years ago, I used to work with a little fuse guy, and it's so funny because he said, one day you're going to be out of business. I said, I hope so. I mean, I hope that we don't have to have PPE because nobody wants to wear it. I mean, if there was I'm a motorcycle rider, and if there was a magical device that I could wear that I wouldn't have to wear a helmet, I would do it, right? Because that's not a comfortable thing to wear. But you know what? There isn't. There's no magical force field that I can turn on when I'm riding my motorcycle, so I will definitely be wearing a helmet. So as well as other PPE. So I hope that answered your question, because in my mind, that is in a company's written electrical safety program, they should absolutely, positively look for ways to mitigate those exposures, bring them down, remove them at all cost.
So there is another question. I think this is aimed towards us. How much do you know about Grace products? You know Grace technologies, and
Yes.
products like those test ports and voltage test stations and such, right? So there's a question. I think I can answer this, but I want you to answer it. So
okay.
How do Grace voltage testing stations, for example, you have a test point where you can minimize the exposure of shock or arc flash hazard when you perform the live dead live test at the door, help us in reducing the requirement for PPE?
Well, okay, so first of all, the live dead live, and this could get into a whole multiple hour long conversation. I just actually trained with a company last week that never even heard of live dead live. And I'm like, are you guys kidding me? 22 electrical workers, not a single one of them knew what live dead live even meant. So when we're talking about going in and doing our confirmation, which is the 7th step of the 8 steps that NFPA 70E requires, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 8 steps to de-energize a circuit are called an electrically safe work condition. Live dead live is critical. And it's interesting when we talk about working energized, OSHA tells us we're supposed to work de-energized except for a couple instances. But when we're going with the meter to go and test for the absence of voltage, that is one of the most dangerous acts that we're going to do. And I think there's enough information from the IEEE to give us that knowledge to say, you know what, misusing that meter is probably higher than 50% of all the arc flash fatalities in this country. So this is where, in my mind, I see Grace Technologies fitting in because of that ability to mitigate that. In my mind, that's an extreme hazard. I mean, that's when the stuff goes wrong. So the fact that you guys have come up with a solution to that, in my mind, we're putting people in a much safer environment. And isn't it better to have people in a safe environment than put them into a hazardous environment with a spacesuit? I mean, it's just better.
Absolutely. So the question is more like, okay, if this arc flash label on that piece of equipment says 40 cal suit, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a person is performing a live test inside the cabinet, then is exposed to the full incident energy. Now we bring this outside the door through an impedance protected circuit. So will that bring it to 12 cal, or maybe what does that do to the arc flash PPE?
Well, Banu, I'm not that familiar with it, but I will tell you this: if there's no, is there any exposure? Is the equipment in normal operating condition? I mean, is he actually touching energized conductors with the? In my mind, I don't see any need for PPE.
Exactly. So basically, the facility PPE applies. That's what we tell them. The reason is you minimize the max fault to only 3.5 milliamps or fewer, so less.
Right.
So that basically takes out your shock and arc flash hazard. You don't create an arc, and that's how you will list these products to be mounted outside the door. So there is no,
fantastic.
I don't want to answer that question. I just want you to take your input on what you think. So that's,
it's interesting that prior to 2015, NFPA 7D made a great change in 2015, which is regarding working on equipment that's labeled. We used to have companies that say, hey, Steve, we got these disconnects over here, and they're labeled because when the company came in and did their incident energy risk assessments, they put labels on this, and we've got operators going in and all they're doing is turning it on and off. And, prior to 2015, the answer was not a fun answer. You guys got to wear PPE. And we're talking equipment operators, not even exposed to energized bus. And so, but it was labeled, and we know that operating a piece of switchgear or operating a switch, according to NFPA 7D, can cause an arc flash. So now in 2015, they addressed the fact that, hey, if it's a normal operating condition, you may not need to wear PPE, and that's what I love. And it sounds like what Grace Technologies has done is taken that extremely hazardous event of doing a live dead live and remove that out of the equation. And in my mind, that's fantastic.
Thank you. So the next question, Steve, is there a company out there that tests older PPE equipment to make sure it hasn't become a liability and they need to toss it? Do you know of any companies that do the testing on older PPEs to ensure?
Yeah, so when it comes to testing, and this is great for manufacturers, Hugh Hoagland owns a company, or I guess I think that he's working with Kinectrics, and I think it's called Arcware, and they actually are, if you're a manufacturer, you can go to Arcware and they will actually test it for you. In other words, Oberon has been testing at Kinectrics for, gosh, 30 years. So we've been there testing our stuff ourselves, and we've earned that privilege. But if you've got a company that has not tested your PPE, you don't have any certificate of conformity of compliance, man, go to Hugh, get them to do some testing for you, because they actually on the website list the manufacturers who test there.
Sure, that's good. So the next question is, as a manufacturer of machinery, we place labels stating PPE required on our electrical enclosures. Should we be specifying the level required?
Absolutely. One of the most, and listen, whoever sold that bill of goods to you guys, I'm sorry. That's one of the most asinine labels I've seen in the industry, where it says, warning, electrical hazard exists, electric shock and arc flash potential. And I'm like, well, that's any electrical circuit, right?
Yeah.
So sorry I called it asinine, but that is asinine. So sorry.
That's true, because I think at least those are sold in the United States and Canada probably definitely must have it, because it's a requirement, right? So
yep. Years ago, I had a gentleman who came from Canada, and he came down to Texas to run a safety department. Let me tell you, there was a lot of raised eyebrows, but this guy was really focused on preventing injury and fatality to his personnel. And he said, Steve, if you get a chance, I want you to run by this place in Texas. It's one of our processing centers, and just take a look in our MCC room and tell me if you think we have a problem. Well, he was setting me up, and I knew he was. So I went there a couple weeks later, and they opened up the MCC room, and I just peeked in, and I saw that same label, warning, arc flash, and electric shock hazard. And I just said, you can close the door. The guy said, I've seen enough. I called him up. You got a problem. You're telling people there's a hazard, but you're not telling them what to do to mitigate it.
Okay, well, that's good. So the next one, I think we'll take one more question. We have had 2 arc flash incidents where plant operators were only closing, opening a power breaker, not racking, but just closing or opening locally. So what do you recommend for those operations?
Well, anytime you have exposure to energized bus, whether you're just opening or closing, let me make sure I understand this question right. They're only turning on and turning off equipment, no exposure to energized bus?
That's correct.
But they still had an arc flash event.
Yeah.
All right. So that tells me that there's some problems. I'm going to say look at your maintenance of that equipment. But this is why we label stuff. So according to NFPA 70E, there's some parameters that they state for normal operating condition. I'm going to say a lack of maintenance may be one of those.
Yep.
Was it used as it was intended?
Correct. You're right. I mean, one of those criteria is they need to demonstrate the equipment has been properly maintained and there is no impending failure and the doors are closed and such. There are like 6 different criteria for meeting that definition of what is a normal operating condition. So
I would say that, and the maintenance has to be documented. I love it when I go to a company and say, oh yeah, this stuff is properly maintained. I said, where's the documents on it? And they're like, oh no, we just do our PMs on it. Well, okay, where's the documentation of that? And they're like, well, yeah, they don't have it. So, and it has to be maintained as the manufacturer for that piece of equipment specifies it. And if you can't find that manufacturer's equipment specification, you go to NFPA 70B and you can get a lot of information there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I think the documentation is pretty important as well, as you said, because I remember talking to one of those safety guys at the ESW conference several years ago, and they're like, if something is not documented, that didn't happen.
Exactly. It did not happen. Yep. And listen, this goes to your safety planning. This goes to your job briefing. I mean, it's funny. A company I was talking to a couple of weeks ago was telling me about their job briefing. And it's like, well, do you document it? No. We just have a conversation before we sit down and work energized. Like, well, don't you think it ought to be documented? I mean, otherwise it's just speculation that it occurred or didn't occur.
Yeah, that's true. So the breaker failure you're talking about, was it a nuclear power plant? And they do a lot of maintenance, but still something failed in the breaker and that led to an incident. So that's
right. And so in my mind, if you wanted to tell me that as a safety director for that operation that you wanted to follow NFPA 70E to the rule and just say, well, NFPA 70E says that we don't have to wear PPE just by turning it on and off, or energizing, de-energizing. Well, I'm going to tell you that your safety program can exceed NFPA 70. You can say, even though that's what NFPA 70 says, we're going to always wear our PPE because we've had incidents occur. And in my mind, this is where the power of the written electrical safety program comes in and trumps the 70E. Because I had a gentleman, a friend of mine here in the Dallas area, who was actually on the stand in a court of law, and the question asked them, what did your company do above and beyond the minimum standards of NFPA 70E? Now, you obviously know that was an attorney asking him that question, but it's something we all have to consider. There's things that aren't in NFPA 70 that I think should be in there. So as we look at our electrical safety program as a whole, or do we have gaps? And do we have gaps that maybe even NFPA 70 doesn't address? And that might be one of them. Hey, we've had 2 arc flash incidents. All we were doing is energizing or de-energizing. Well, hey, let's wear PPE every time we energize and de-energize now, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true. And then there are a lot of this, I mean, as you mentioned, 70E is again a minimum performance requirements, right? It is, people can exceed what's called out NFPA 70E itself.
Yep.
So it's not that just measure up to just the baselines or the minimum requirements. And also there was a comment here, 70E 2021 requires arc flash PPE to be worn when switching a new breaker or a breaker that just came back from a maintenance cycle. So that's true, right? So because
absolutely. Because that doesn't meet the criteria of normal operating condition. One of the criteria for normal operating condition is that it's in
functional sound.
Yeah, my mind just went blank for a second. It's just that it's been installed correctly. That's what I was trying to grab. So installed correctly, the only evidence of that is it's been working. If you're installing it the first time, you don't know that it's installed correctly until you've energized it.
Yeah, I mean, do you also know the CBS arc safe or the chicken switch? They make this remote close mechanism. So that's it's a much better way to mitigate.
It's an administrative control. It's way above the PPE on the hierarchy of control. So we just changed the way people do work. I hate that they call it a chicken switch because guys don't want to use it. But you know what? That's putting guys a lot further away from the hazard.
All right, I think we are at 11 o'clock. Steve, thank you so much for doing this for us today, and we really enjoyed the presentation. And whoever has attended this webinar, they will get this continuing education credits or CEUs, we call it. And also the recorded version will be posted on the YouTube, and also we'll have a link sent out to all the attendees. So whoever has missed this webinar, they'll have an opportunity to go and look at this again. Okay. Thank you again so much, Steve, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.